Hi, welcome everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, hi. Okay, so we're really pleased that you all were patient with us with all of our technical setup and everything. So we, the Faculty Coalition, Gaza at USD, and Southern California Educators for Palestine are pleased to open the semester's teach-in series of events tonight. So this is our first event of the year. I'm Susie Babka, Professor of Theology and Religious Studies here at the University of San Diego. The Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, the year 5786, arrived this week demanding that we all commit to the work of Tikkun Olam, repairing the broken world. This idea has always been one of my favorites in Judaism because it means that we all share in God's work of bringing about justice. We don't wait for divine power to intervene apart from us. Rather, we are the means by which divine power is active in the world. And so we must do everything in our power to end the Israeli government's genocide of Palestinians and build a future of freedom and sanctuary for Palestinians and for all people everywhere. In the season of Yom Kippur, this is a moment of collective atonement. Right now, the Israeli military is starving over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza to death. We call on the U.S. government to end its support for the Israeli government's genocide, and we call on all people of conscience to divest from death and speak out in defense of life. Nothing is more urgent. Speaking for us tonight is a dear friend of the coalition who has been with us from the beginning, Jonathan Graubart, who is professor and chair of the Political Science Department at San Diego State University. He specializes in international relations, international law, Israel-Palestine, Zionism, and Jewish descent. He received his PhD in political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2002, and his JD from UC Berkeley Law School in 1989. Dr. Graubart's recent book is Jewish Self-Determination Beyond Zionism, Lessons from Hannah Arendt and Other Pariahs, which was published by Temple University Press. His latest article is, quote, "It is deadly and oppressive, but is it one state? Assessing the new one-state reality paradigm" in Palestine-Israel Review. His chapter, Resisting Dual Oppression, Hannah Arendt's Lessons for Contemporary American Jewish Pariahs, is forthcoming in an edited volume on Hannah Arendt. His present projects deal with the problems of Blue Ribbon University task forces on anti-Semitism and the International Criminal Court's startling request for arrest warrants of Israel's prime minister and defense minister. Dr. Graubart occasionally writes op-eds for such forums as Truth Out, Common Dreams, and Academe, which is Academic Freedom blog, and serves on the Academic Advisory Board of Jewish Voice for Peace. For Inside Higher Ed, he penned The Unrecognized Anti-Semitism, the Erasure of Jewish Descent. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. Please welcome Professor Graubart.
Okay, thank you, Susie, for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be back at the University of San Diego. I've been impressed that from the early days of the post-October 7th era, it seemed of the universities in San Diego that University of San Diego did the best job of getting a network of faculty involved with very useful teach-ins. I was happy to take part in a few prior ones, so it's nice to launch it for this fall. One bit of bad news, some of you had heard, I see some students of Professor Varadaraj and my colleague. Originally, the two of us were going to kind of team present this with different strengths. She wasn't able to make it. She just has a lot of things coming up before she leaves for India for 3 months. So hopefully it won't walk out just because it's me and not my colleague, but I'll do my best. Okay, so my talk is called Israel's Assault on Gaza. Is Israel's assault on Gaza genocide, and doesn't matter what we call it. So I'll give you the answer right away to the first one, yes. To the second question, that's a tougher one. You can find things to say yes and things to say no, and so I'll get into that. All right. First, besides including kind of the legal definition of genocide, I thought it's useful to break apart how genocide is commonly discussed, in kind of the international public. And so I break it up into kind of three types. Sort of the popular casual discussion. That's a term just it's brought out when people think something particularly awful is happening. And so if you say genocide, you're really showing you're serious about this. It's often used as an advocacy tool by activists or, ominously, as justification by governments to intervene, including militarily. The popular casual discussion tends to be ad hoc and selective. It can get people like me who are kind of very interested in the legal and scholarly issues a little bit annoyed that the term is thrown out loosely. And I think probably even, at least in the early days after October 7th, there was a fair amount of reluctance, including from people like me, to jump to calling it genocide. But now it certainly is taking on something hard to deny. So that's one element. The second is what I call the socio-historical scholarship. So those are works that are interested in identifying broader structures, broader institutions, belief systems, intergroup relations, and historical context, whether it's the domestic setting, the regional, or the global level that can lead to genocide. One of my heroes, Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism. That magisterial project was at first influenced by explaining the genocide of the Jews. So in a way, that's the project, is looking for that broader analysis. And so you can think of works on Rwanda, too, looking more deeply. The father of the leading candidate for the mayor of New York, Mahmoud Mamdani, he wrote a great piece looking at the whole structural analysis that led to the genocide in Rwanda. So there's a strong amount of socio-historical scholarship. I don't think there's a consensus. They don't have a consensus set of conditions for determining when it becomes genocide. And then the beauty, I suppose, of the legal definition is there is a focus. So it's the 1948 Genocide Convention, and supplemented, as most law is, by legal rulings, so particularly international tribunals. And, you can look at, the various things, but, in particular, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So a big part of that, the A, B, C, D, and E is physical action, actually doing great destruction. But what makes it even more difficult to determine legally that some regime has crossed the line into genocide is you have to find specific intent. As such is referring to the specific intent. And this was done deliberately, so the United States and its leading allies, they're taking the lead in establishing the official legal definition of genocide right after World War II. And they are careful to come up with language that's not going to implicate their atrocities. So, if they had kind of what was seen as sort of the demonic attitude of the Nazis, I could say, well, we don't do things like this. And so demanding very explicit, specific intent from the perpetrators to destroy, at least in part, a distinct group, was meant to make it difficult, particularly difficult to go after, say, the respectable powers of the global order. And it certainly was making clear that it can't just be the product of either an unchecked war strategy or an unchecked imperial conquest. Now, it has been determined that you don't need a smoking gun, so you don't need literal documents from leaders about their specific plans to commit genocide. You can infer it from a pattern of actions. According to the International Court of Justice's ruling in 2015, you can infer the intent to destroy a target group in whole or in part, but if you're just doing it from inference, that has to be the only rational interpretation of the pattern. And so often that means if you can show it's just war aims going too far, and look, that's still what Israel and its partisans are hoping for, probably in the final International Court of Justice ruling. And so certainly up to at least 2024, all official declarations of genocide have been reserved for regimes that fell out of favor with the United States and other leading states. So it was politicized, and I'll come back to it. The surprising thing, however, is there really is an emerging expert consensus now. It's not just from partisans, longtime partisans of Palestine and Israel. Now there is an emerging expert consensus that Israel's conduct in Gaza crosses the line into genocide. And so I've looked through a lot of these documents. You could say from the socio-historical scholarship, one representation of that would be the International Association of Genocide Scholars, so the ones who do comparative genocide studies. So they overwhelmingly approved a statement just last August classifying Israel's assault on Gaza as genocide. Major human rights groups have generally been quite wary of throwing out the term genocide. So these aren't partisan groups that are just throwing it around loosely. So groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and then Israel's group of Palestinian and Israeli scholars, the B'Tselem, they've all come out with comprehensive reports finding and documenting how this crosses the line into genocide. We could add distinguished UN investigatory bodies like the Human Rights Council. In particular, it's the I keep forgetting the full name, but the Independent International Commission for the Occupied Palestinian Territory. So that statement just came out. And that statement is, of all these, probably the most geared as kind of a brief to the ICJ about why the evidence is overwhelming and why it's not just all the actions, but how we can find plenty of evidence of intent. And then, while I don't have a crystal ball, and at one point, if you had asked me this like in January of 2024, I think I still would have predicted that the ICJ would not get a majority of finding this genocide. Now, I think just based, and I'll go into it, but just based on everything that's happened, I'd be very surprised if when the ICJ decision comes out, so that was the case brought by South Africa against Israel, I'd be very surprised if they don't get a solid majority finding it genocide. And I think right partisans of Israel know that. I think they know they're in bad shape. So what's the basis for the expert consensus? I'm not going to go into detail. It gets just a little overwhelming to point out kind of all the different things, just reading the news each day. But what I tried to do was distilling from the various reports, what's leading them all to the same bottom line conclusion. So one, of course, is the sheer scale of destruction, now close to 2 years. So direct killings, if we start with let's say the confirmed deaths where they can find the names, so that's the Gaza Health Ministry. So we know it's 65,000. And interestingly, Israel doesn't seem to deny, the numbers they come up with end up being fairly similar to what the Gaza Health Ministry, the debate, Israel will say, well, yeah, but a lot of them are, quote, terrorists, unquote. But the actual numbers of even confirmed ones are not in much dispute. It's also not in much dispute that the actual numbers are likely far higher, that the 65,000 represents the ones who can be confirmed. But whether they're buried in the rubble or just unaccounted, it could be several times higher. And then if you add in just indirect deaths, this kind of keeps. So the numbers are rather vast, particularly for an area that has just over 2 million in population. So it really is one of the great atrocities, in this case of the 21st century. So the sheer scale, and then I think this is often neglected in some of the analysis on whether or not Israel's engaged in genocide. The historical record does matter even for legal analysis. And so the sense is that you have to look at the context, particularly if you're trying to get to intent and just the systematic nature. And so all these groups, whether it's B'Tselem, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or the Human Rights Council, they're all factoring that in. And you can look at both deep history and more recent history. So certainly dating back to the Nakba of 1948, there's a long record of expulsion of Palestinians, so close to 800,000, right in 1948. Systematic discrimination, attacks of Palestinians, and I think perhaps even more important for the intent issue is it was very explicit in, say, the early days of the State of Israel to marginalize even the idea that there was a Palestinian presence, right? You couldn't even say Palestinians, you had to use the term Israeli Arabs. And this logic that, okay, they're just calling them the Arabs, but it's not just that they're an enemy, that they're an existential threat to Israel, to the whole idea of a Jewish nation state. So if you have that mindset from the outset, that this is not just a normal enemy, this is an enemy that's an existential threat to what we want to be, so they're taking that into account. And then if we want to just look at Gaza more specifically, so since 2007, so since the more intense blockade developed after the split between Hamas and Fatah, and Hamas takes over Gaza, is since 2007, they've normalized the idea in Israel of collective punishment of the population. So little even questioning about the whole logic of a collective siege, in a sense punishing them for electing Hamas. So this includes severe restrictions on supplies, on a movement of population. And in the B'Tselem report, they've done several on these. They've documented how since 2007, Israel has particularly looked at Gaza as a, quote, laboratory, unquote, for testing extreme military and administrative practices. So the effect is that Israel has been primed, let's say especially since 2007, for massive destruction of Gazans that could lead all the way to genocide. Then we have, just in the 2022 elections, the end of 2022, in one sense it was hard to believe possible, but an even more extremist government in Israel took over. So the far-right Messianic Jewish parties are part of the coalition. Several who have prominent cabinet roles have a long record of calling for ethnic cleansing and have actually been involved and sometimes arrested in terrorist plots like within Israel against Palestinians. So the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, and the national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. And so it's meant since late 2022 that there's been a further unleashing of the settler militias, particularly in the West Bank, more active and close cooperation with the military, so more embedding of extremist militias into the Israeli Defense Force, and the attacks and killings and expulsions of Palestinians have magnified so well before October 7th, and greater abuse in the detention camps. Okay, and then this perhaps is a shout out to my former PhD advisor, Michael Barnett. Way back when I was at Wisconsin, we used to argue about Israel-Palestine. So he was kind of a liberal Zionist, so it's not that he defended the right-wing elements, but he kind of defended against those complaining about the early days of the Second Intifada. And so I'm glad to see that he's come around. So he's a prominent scholar of international relations and of genocide, too. And so he put out this thing, probably deserved more attention. This came out around March 2023. It was a blog thing, but it was passed around. And he worked out that if you want to think of where's the greatest risk in the world of genocide taking place, Israel was put as near the, at the top, maybe with a few other competitors, but up there. And what Michael Barnett did, I'm just spelling out the bullet points here, is he looked at this UN report made up of scholars on, this was in 2014, on the warning signs for a genocide. This was part of a UN effort to try to mobilize more attention and support for checking genocidal actions before they actually become outright genocide. So using the UN report, Barnett just looked at the following factors. Okay, so a pattern of discrimination against a distinct group. Okay, well, that's pretty easy to check. And, I said that goes all the way back to 1948. Signs of intent to destroy in whole or in part a group member. Again, you can say it goes back to 1948, but you can see just a renewed emphasis in late 2022, in part to cleanse out much of the West Bank. Signs of intent to destroy in whole or in part that group. Okay, I got that, sorry. Signs of widespread attacks of civilians. So again, that's systematic, but increasing by late 2022. Serious violations, what were we at? Oh yeah, serious violations of human rights and humanitarian law. Well, certainly Israel was a constant source of documented reports that they're violating basic human rights, basic humanitarian laws, and not only that, they tend to deny that the bulk of international humanitarian laws even apply to their conduct in the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza. And then, are they showing threatening movements toward outside humanitarian groups? Okay, it's obviously gotten worse in the last year, but even well before October 7th, there was all sorts of pressure that Israel was placing on human rights groups, humanitarian groups, new laws being passed that ban getting funding or cooperation with outside NGOs. So they were certainly showing threatening actions toward outside humanitarian groups. And the idea is you add these all up. It means it's not necessarily going to happen right away, something that you actually say crosses the line to genocide, but the conditions are there if there's a trigger. And so that trigger happened with October 7th. And so the other basis for the consensus, well, Israeli officials keep saying it. So, okay, here's the most flagrant from the Prime Minister Netanyahu, referring to Amalek. You must remember what Amalek has done to you. So these things that it's not even all that subtle most of the time, the logic that all Gazans are the enemy and all need to be killed. And so that's being communicated by a whole range of political leaders, military leaders, and the sentiments are clearly being filtered down to numerous military units. You look at all sorts of graffiti, you look at reports of, even from soldiers bothered by the conscience that, yeah, this is what we were being told, this is what we're celebrating. So it's not just what's called genocidal rhetoric. Genocidal rhetoric would mean, okay, nasty stuff, but it's really just bluster. It's not just bluster if it's filtering down, and military people are repeating it, and it's filtering down to the military units. The repeated attacks and blockades that there's no concrete military objective. And so these various reports, that's part of what they're doing because you do have to show this is separate from just kind of a military action that went out of control. And so they're showing many sorts of actions, attacks that you can't see any possible. that, I mean, Israel's intelligence is pretty good that you couldn't find any sort of Hamas militias units. So they're documenting all that to bring out the strong inference that this is not a military. The only rational thing is to just go after Gazans as such. And then I think probably, this is my reading, what's kind of flipped a lot of people who were pretty reluctant to use the genocide charge is the duration of the destruction, so we're now approaching 2 years, combined with just open defiance from Israel that they're going to change their behavior in any way. And so multiple findings, right, being reported even in very respectable press organizations, including the New York Times, that there really is mass starvation, there's famine, free fire zones, mass atrocities, hospitals are in desperate condition. And there were several provisional orders from the International Court of Justice starting in early 2024 saying that, okay, we haven't yet made our determination whether this is genocide, but we certainly are seeing the incitement to genocide, and we're seeing the prospects. So we do order, I mean, this was an actual order to take measures to punish the incitement and to improve humanitarian access. And there was an order to call off the invasion of Rafah. So Israel ignored all of that. So in that sense, they actually blatantly rejected legal requirements. And I think all that element just makes it harder and harder why so many are coming out saying that I was pretty reluctant at first, but the fact that it's not stopping and Israel's as defiant as ever, that's the element I think that's more tipped the scales than anything else. It's just like no end in sight. Okay, so that's why, in short, I think there's a very good case, and this is why we have this emerging legal consensus. That part I feel pretty confident about. The part that's actually harder to determine is, will this matter? That we get the Gaza assault declared, officially declared genocide. And so the positive part of me can say, let's say in particular the likelihood that the ICJ actually does get a solid majority that finds that Israel's committed genocide. There are some useful things, and now too, even before the actual ICJ ruling, is I think it happens to helpfully depict just the gravity of what Israel has become. If there are always things that people like me had objections about Israel, the sense of, okay, yeah, there was this Jewish supremacy from the beginning. There was this willingness to attack civilians. But the whole logic and just the lack of even pretense anymore from Israeli officials that they care about international law, that they care about human rights, that they care about even, let's say, liberal democracy, and by liberal I mean some kind of rule of law, is that given the power of genocide, there is something useful about saying that this is really what Israel has become. I would add, to this first bullet point, it also gives some clarity to just how depraved, or at least inadequate, let's say the major liberal democracies in the world, United States, Canada, most of Europe, they're staying away, certainly, from calling it genocide. They're staying away from any, at least significant, rebuke. And so that, too, even with all the overwhelming evidence of genocide, it does show a really big limit, and that's just how fragile. And here we can't just blame far-right nationalists. This extends far beyond, say, the Trump administration in the United States, which would not have been as much of a surprise. And then I'd say it has been useful, certainly, as a tool for two things: mobilization from below and shaming of powerful. I could think of even my labor union, the California Faculty Association, which for a long time just said, no, we really should just be thinking about, wages and benefits for faculty. And pretty much just wanted to stay away from anything on Israel-Palestine. That was true, I guess, well into 2024. But the CFA would just be one example of now a number of unions, institutions, once it just becomes so overwhelming that you can call this genocide. I think it has been a powerful tool, certainly for getting artists, other civil society churches, I guess particularly churches, but maybe to a lesser extent synagogues and mosques. And so all that's useful, and certainly one should do whatever one can to try to mobilize opposition to not just the awful things since October 7th, but just the nature, say, of Israeli society. So that's like the positive. The negative part, the reasons not to take much hope in the official declaration. Well, the bottom line is this emerging and overwhelming consensus from, say, experts, practitioners, that this is genocide, has not stopped, doesn't really seem to have mitigated Israel's assaults on Gaza. It just continues. If anything, Israel's destruction has intensified since the first wave of serious denunciations, including the recent human rights reports. And again, think about the provisional orders of the International Court of Justice, is that Israel continues among Israeli Jewish society. While there is growing opposition to carrying on the war, for their own reasons, there's not much recognition, reckoning with just the horrors that Israel has done to the Palestinians. So one of the most alarming polls showed that 82% of Israeli Jews support the expulsion of all Gazans. And you think expulsion, what it would take to expel all Gazans, that would be genocide in itself. So in that sense, it's not working in its bottom line. Depressing thing here in the United States is, while opposition is obviously growing in the United States, Israel still maintains strong support, right? It still gets billions, military aid, diplomatic support. At least the elites of both parties. I know there's people like Mamdani and others. There's the left of the Democratic Party that's getting better, but still the heart of the political elites are still solidly standing behind Israel. And it is remarkable. My current work, as Susie pointed out, is on the task forces on anti-Semitism in universities, who are well-educated people. But it really bothers me that what they're most focused on is, okay, so maybe there were a few heated comments at rallies, condemning Israel's genocide, rather than thinking maybe the primary reason why there's so much opposition to Israel, and even, let's say, heated rhetoric, is just because of the sheer scale and horror and U.S. complicity, including the sense U.S. universities, including my own San Diego State, that has open cooperation with Israeli universities. One of the pieces I recently wrote, it was in Common Dreams. It was an incident with, I forget what it was called, but it was an Israeli propagandist. I forget what they called it, so I forget, but it's basically something that was kind of a department of propaganda that was started in the early 21st century, funded by the finance ministry of Israeli government. So Ido Aharoni. So he's part of this visiting Israeli scholars program in San Diego. And so he was recently speaking both at San Diego State and at UCSD. And he was there to defend Israel's actions, to defend what most are considering genocide, and to put all the condemnation. And what did the UCSD leadership, so in this case UCSD was even worse than San Diego State, is they not only platformed Ido Aharoni, they then went after protesters who were carrying out protests outside the hall where Aharoni. That was their only focus. And that kind of bizarre universe where you focus on the critics, you try to find a few gotcha moments, but you ignore the big elephant in the room. And leading universities, and this we can't just blame on being scared by Trump. This happened before Trump got elected. It was going on with the support of the Biden administration. We can say Governor Newsom in California and Democratic legislatures in California. So that part is, I think, the hope people had. Well, if we can just give the finding of genocide, and genocide seemingly has all these requirements of taking action, it's been so empty in practice. And it's not just kind of right-wing nationalist movements. It's extending to the heart of mainstream, including liberalism. Europe may be a little bit better. So I'm not talking about Ireland now. Ireland obviously is much better on this. But the heart of Europe is not much better than the US. They've gone a little bit further in the European Union in condemning Israel's assault and even now threatening some type of trade sanctions. They're still staying away from the genocide label. Germany in particular still sells military weapons to Israel. And so if Europe was considered kind of more the great hope, more than the United States, of following international law, the limits there, and they too, right, particularly in Great Britain, well, in Germany also, they're spending more of their time condemning protesters than they are condemning what Israel's doing. So you're more likely to be condemned calling Israel's actions genocide than you are to So you're more likely to be condemned protesting it than you are apologizing for genocide. Okay, sorry, I've been teaching all day. Okay, so, and then I close with some parting shots on the historical and ongoing value of the anti-genocide regime in place since 1948. So something I've studied for a couple of decades. I think when I wore a younger man's clothes, when I was younger, was kind of very excited about coming up with a regime of genocide, and I followed the Nuremberg Tribunal with great excitement, and then the Genocide Convention. But having certainly big doubts. And it's true that the value of a global principle to stand against and punish regimes that seek to eliminate an entire group, that still, in principle, is a very good cause. And in so much there was part of that after the Nazi Holocaust. There were some appealing sentiments, but the mission was flawed from the outset. The convention itself is, as I write, shallow in scope. It's looking for it to be confined to kind of demonic regimes rather than thinking broadly about the structural conditions that lead toward the horrifying destruction. And ultimately, as I said before, it was written in a way that omitted imperialist atrocities. So it's no surprise then that shortly after World War II, you get three of the, I'll put aside the Soviet Union as a special case, but let's say the three we consider liberal democracies, Great Britain, France, and the United States, they all carried on renewed brutal campaigns. So the Brits in Kenya, the French in Algeria, and the United States in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And there was nothing that was restricting them. So there was something kind of empty from the outset. Another thing, I guess people like me who kind of situate global regimes, including seemingly appealing ones in broader hierarchical or imperialist politics, is the United States and allies have been able to instrumentalize the charge of genocide to justify bloody military interventions that are not motivated by stopping genocide. So whether it's in the Balkans in the 1990s, in Africa, in Iraq, genocide's become just kind of another rhetorical weapon to use to justify just ongoing crude imperialist actions from the dominant powers. So it's been hard to see as a net. Not that I'm telling human rights groups and activists not to use it, I'm still going to use it, but I still want to have kind of a broader reflection of its limitations. And so it may turn out that we're going to get an official judgment from the International Court of Justice finding that Israel's engaged in genocide. But we're also going to see that it's going to be followed by inaction, denial. I'm sure the United States will just put sanctions on International Court of Justice officials, and Europe is not going to be much better. And that may just put the final nail on the coffin, at least taking the formal legal anti-genocide regime seriously. And so whether or not you find some excitement still about focusing on the genocide, I'd say those of us devoted to not just holding Israel to account for atrocities that long predate October 7th, but the dominant imperialist powers, including the United States, I think we're well advised to spend less attention on the genocide label and focus on kind of broader political transformation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go around and see if anyone has any questions. I guess I get to ask the first one because I have a microphone. Just listening to the talk and thinking about the own research that I've done in this area, I keep coming back to Raphael Lemkin and the history of the formation of the term genocide and how that came to be, and when the UN started to think about looking at genocide and how to have an agreement on how to talk about it, and that the US would not enter into an agreement because they did not want to realize that the way that the US had been treating the Native Americans, the indigenous peoples, and the peoples forced into slavery was a genocide, and that they would have to do that in order to enter into the UN agreement, that they would have to, effectively accuse themselves of genocide. And it seems to me that might be one of the biggest stumbling blocks to all of this, is that the U.S. has failed to recognize the log in their own eye in order to, in other words, that we as a country are complicit in allowing Israel to get away with what it gets away with and continuing to support what they do, because we have not admitted our own genocides as a nation and how formative these genocides were in our own history. And so I'm wondering if it was ever possible for us as a country to do that, if we could bring back the idea of genocide with any sort of scope or weight or gravity in terms of the world. And until we do that, I don't know if it is possible for us to ever be able to point the finger anywhere and say this is happening anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, look, I essentially agree. One can have different views of Lemkin, but certainly he wanted to be far more extended. For example, he didn't want the categories so limited to just national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. You can think, let's say, U.S. and Vietnam. Horrifying actions, right? Killed millions of people. And it often was kill anything that moves. So comparable, say, to the U.S. actions in Gaza. But one could say, well, it wasn't genocide because, well, they're siding with one group of Vietnamese. And so if all you're looking is, it's not quite clear what the national group and so forth. But the atrocities were just as bad. Is that too? And so that's part of why the United States and others went away from Lemkin, because Lemkin wanted it to make more broadly. And yeah, in part, they don't want to reckon with their past, but maybe even more importantly, they don't want to open the door to what they're still planning to do. So I mentioned a few things, but think about Guatemala. So it starts, the United States supports the coup in Guatemala in 1954. That then leads to several decades of what the UN eventually declared to be genocide. And the closest ally of Guatemala all those years was the United States. There still wasn't much of a reckoning here about that. So yeah, I think no one wants, the powerful in particular, so it's not just the US, they don't want to be held accountable for what they're doing. They were hoping, okay, the Nuremberg one was nice because they could show the United States as kind of the heroes, the victors. But they also, this is something I've written about with my colleague Vaidaraja, and they also were able to script that trial, the Nuremberg Tribunal, to make sure other atrocities weren't brought out. So they liked having their cake and eating it too. But I agree with your bottom line is until countries are really willing to do a reckoning, especially the powerful countries. Yeah.
When you walk off, use the microphone because we're recording.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Use the handheld.
Oh, okay. Is this on?
Yeah.
Hello?
No, press the button.
Oh. Hello? Oh, sorry. Got it. Okay. Excuse my incompetence. I think I got it now. Okay.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your presentation, which is really, really, really important. When I walked in here, I was asking myself, do we have to debate it? Because it's been so well documented. Mm-hmm. But since this is a teach-in, and we have a lot of students and others who are not familiar with what's going on internationally among genocide scholars, etc., I think it's really important you gave us the background and the evidence to make an argument, or at least when people challenge anybody in the audience, it's not a genocide. All you have to say is, let's look at the evidence and let's look at what has been established by credible sources. So that's really important. I have a lot of questions and comments, but I'll just want to engage with what you said, Susie, because the US has ratified the Genocide Convention. It did not initially do so, but it has ratified the Genocide Convention, which is really important. So to say today that it's what the US did to its indigenous populations that's holding it back from recognizing what's happening in Gaza is not true. So I just want to make sure that if any official, American official, etc., comes up with an idea, let's not bring up the genocide of the indigenous people. The reason the US is wedded to Israel is political, deep, etc. You're right in bringing up other countries have had their genocides historically, but the genocide of Israel is very unique and very specific.
I guess I'll add a point about the U.S. for those interested. It wasn't until 1988 that they finally ratified. I mean, that kind of surprised me in my younger days, that because the United States was promoting it, but they did not want to ratify it for the reasons Susie pointed out. 1988, they finally do, and I don't know, at least the older people might remember Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina. So he finally dropped kind of his all-out filibusters and allowed the 2/3 of the Senate to finally get the United States to ratify it. But he was quite proud that he did reservations. So this is kind of a legal term saying this is how we understand our obligation. And the biggest one is no outside court can ever sit in judgment of whether or not we're engaged in genocide. So that there's no danger that the United States is ever going to be hauled before the ICJ. So even when they did, quote, ratify it, the United States does have a particularly notorious record of never allowing other bodies to adjudicate it. So Jesse Helms said, it's fine now because this is completely toothless. So yeah, he's not going to agree to it himself, but he's saying, I'll stop the filibuster.
I think all of us are kind of disappointed looking at the international mechanism of justice that is supposed to enforce laws of war and prohibition against genocide. It's always focused in the rearview mirror. It takes a long, long time for that process to unfold, and by the time that it finally does, even if it reaches the correct conclusion, it's too late for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people. But we should never lose sight of the fact that there's a sea change that has taken place with respect to Israel and Gaza and Palestine generally. A sea change in world opinion has taken place. And there is, in fact, a sea change taking place in American public opinion as well. There used to be just sort of universal consensus among the American population that everything Israel did was all right. And repeatedly, public opinion polling in the last few months has been showing, first off, that a majority of people, ordinary people in the United States, believe that Israel is committing genocide, and they're using it, of course, in the popular casual version of it. They're not tuned into the legal niceties. And that last month there's polling results showing that 60% of the American public is against any further arms supply to Israel. This would have been unthinkable just a year ago or even 2 years ago. Things are changing, and I'd like to raise one other indication that things are changing, and it's a news story that's just from today. Netanyahu has flown from Israel to New York City for the meeting of the UN General Assembly. And there are several stories today that I think you might want to go to Google News and check out of the curious course of his flight. He flew this meandering course through the Mediterranean and then flew out through the Pillars of Hercules, through the opening, but the Western Mediterranean between Gibraltar and the Atlas Mountains, because he did not want to fly through either Spanish or French airspace, because in Spanish or French airspace, he is liable to arrest on international war crimes warrants that have been issued.
That's an important point. Thanks.
So yeah, I just wanted to engage one of the last points you made. So maybe it's not entirely fair because you were wrapping up and you said you had some shots to make. Maybe it's not entirely fair. But I just feel like what you had to say about the usefulness of the genocide regime, a similar point can be made about the usefulness, an analogous point can be made about the usefulness of international law in general, right? And I think you would want to agree that even though the genocide regime has been abused and all international law has been abused for the purpose of imperial interests and power, that nonetheless, legal institutions have a logic of their own. And I think what we're finding is that despite the International Criminal Court's intention from the beginning to keep away from all the allies of the great powers, it found itself, its internal logic led it to the place where it was possible to issue the arrest warrants for Netanyahu. So I think it's just important to remember that just because law is amenable to power, power needs law too for its legitimation. And therefore, law also has a way of pushing back. It's not going to be able to push back and win, but it's not nothing. I don't think you would probably disagree.
No,
I just
don't
think
disagree.
that maybe I thought your point was too strongly made about the genocide regime and the disappointment of the genocide regime. The genocide regime might still show through the ICJ that there is something there. It's not nothing. It's not what we want. But anyway, that's the only point.
Well, thank you for bringing that out. Look, I'm actually pretty torn, so I ended up spending less time on this because I'm still kind of working through. I've kind of seesawed on this over the years. At one time being very excited about the legal human rights regime and liking the idea of universal standards, and then just being struck by just such a shameless record of international tribunals since Nuremberg that were so one-sided. Israel is then, I mean, it's a unique case in that it's the first one. I mean, so that's the other project I'm working on where you actually have, in this case, the International Criminal Court. They haven't yet talked about genocide, but crimes against humanity and war crimes it's the first time that an ally of a powerful state has actually been indicted. Obviously, we're still a long way from there ever being any trial. And so I can take hope in that. I guess, I'm confident in just saying that the politics precedes the law. I'll still look to see the possibilities. Look, I still donate my money to Amnesty International. I want those groups to exist, and I want ones that are monitoring. But I think there's a danger. I sometimes see this from just some human rights groups, is that if we just sort of play up the human rights angle and we try to divorce politics, they're missing what's going on. So I am torn. Certainly there are some exciting things. It's just don't lead with kind of the legal analysis. So if we had my colleague here, Professor Varadarajan, she would probably have a much more blunt response to you. I'm actually kind of torn. I'm sort of the moderate in this thing, because I do certainly see some value, but I don't want to lose sight of just how much these seemingly lofty international law principles have been so easily manipulated for outright aggression by powerful states.
Okay, yeah. So over the past 9 months, there's been a noticeable shift in the general sentiment towards Israel. And to me, it seems like it's kind of coincided more with the change in our administration rather than an intensifying of actions from Israel. So I guess I wanted to know what your opinion on how much does the Trump administration have to do with that shift in opinion? And I guess, in other words, do you think there would be as negative of an opinion towards Israel if we were under a Democratic administration right now?
Probably the fact that Trump's in power makes it easier for some, those who identify with the Democratic Party, to feel a little bit better about speaking out against Israel, if that's what you mean. I'm still more struck. I think it's important not to forget that this consensus, certainly at the elite level, right? Biden was horrifying too, on kind of the record. The reason I'm looking now at these university task forces on anti-Semitism is most of the people on that task force would probably align with the Democratic Party, would probably consider themselves sort of as moderate liberal and would be mostly appalled at the Trump administration. And they have the freedom. They're still finding all sorts of reasons to avoid the elephant in the room about Israel and just focus on what they see as anti-Semitism on college campuses. And they are not kind of the right-wing nuts. That's still kind of the respectable, let's say Harvard professors and so forth. So probably it's made some difference that some partisans for the Democratic Party can feel like they're not being disloyal, let's say, to Kamala Harris if she had won or something, or to Biden when he was president. It opened up some. I think, what the person in the back said, I take more excitement that there's a general shift going on in U.S. attitude, particularly among young people. I think about that just teaching, is that oddly enough, I'm actually less worried about offending young students now. It's true that the pressure from administration is stronger than ever, but the receptivity among students, and certainly not ones who otherwise identify with the left, is better. So I think those changes are perhaps more lasting and significant than just responding negatively to Trump.
Oh, good evening, and thank you for this presentation. I found it very informative. So as of the past week or two, we've seen some actions from states, particularly in Europe, revolving around the recognition of a Palestinian state. And that had me wondering, you talked about how slow the process that the United Nations and the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice takes on matters like this. Is there action that states can take outside of the model of the UN to sort of put pressure on Israel, for example, the United Kingdom and other states in recognizing a Palestinian state, or more, let's say, forward actions such as the actions that Italy has taken earlier this week?
Yeah, there certainly are all sorts of actions individual states can take. In a way, that's been a long struggle, I'd say, since the 1970s, when there was the first serious effort at the UN. It was sort of the glory days of kind of the PLO, when they had a more coherent, I think, political strategy, and the non-aligned movement was also more coherent and focused. They were pushing the idea that the need for an independent Palestinian state and to condemn the settlements and the occupation. And it did lead individual states to take actions, right? Some stopped recognizing Israel. And so I think probably there's hope on that level. You're still not getting it, say, like United States or Great Britain, or you're still not getting it at the powerful economic states. But in terms of individual states, yeah, I think that's a route to look for, the range of states. And I think, so it's not just in the United States. Gaza in particular, I mean, so Gaza post-October 7th, we were reading this book by Pankaj Mishra, The World After Gaza. I recommend that book. But just as you could say the Nazi Holocaust was a very pivotal period, right, for the middle of the 20th century that shaped Gaza and just the horrors of Gaza in the 21st century. Even though you don't feel it as much in the United States, I think globally that may be one of these pivotal moments that is leading a number of states to kind of take these, rather than the slow process you mentioned about it, trying to eventually get the ICC to actually catch some Israeli. That might still be a long time coming. But individual states, I could see that happening, and certainly that's going to happen in countries that are not so embedded in the U.S. sphere of influence. Because for now, the United States is going to push back against states that has influence over that do that.
Hello. Okay, so we are trapped in this ahistorical perspective that Israel has been selling and safeguarding, that their genocide was this unique thing that happened to this people, and it's never happened before or since, which is completely false. As far as the scale of it, it's on the kind of middle to low as far as the casualties are going. I mean, in the Americas, we lost between 50 and 90 million people who lived here before the Europeans came. So I don't think that we're going to be able to break their hold on the imagination of the West until we put it in as proper perspective. And I don't know when that's going to happen. I mean, but it's foundational to them being able to continue this, that they were the only people to ever have this happen to them. And that's because the Germans were so good at record keeping. Usually people go in and they just kill everybody, like say in Vietnam, everything that moves. The Germans kept these meticulous records, so we have the names of every person that went into the camps, unlike most of the other and many of the greater genocides where we have no idea and we barely even remember that this nation existed.
There is something, I guess it's a related point, is okay, I mentioned the comparative genocide studies, right, is overwhelmingly coming out that this is genocide. If you look at the more narrow field of Holocaust studies, meaning the Nazi Holocaust studies, even some really impressive scholars, looking through the Nazi Holocaust, they've been really terrible in just outright condemning any determination of this being genocide. And they do want that. They're committed to that uniqueness, that the genocide is mostly something that happened to Jews. I think they're willing to concede, they say, Rwanda, as long as it doesn't shake up the primacy of the Nazi Holocaust. And so there is that element, and that also has to be combated, is the extent to which genocide has been so closely connected, without minimizing or diminishing what happened to the Jews and the nature of the Nazi regime, but opening it up. Ultimately, I think opening it up to a full comparative, but a broader structural analysis. And so, I mean, I say that to kind of complement what you're saying about getting a richer perspective on how genocide entails and when it takes place.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to comment. Some years ago, actually about 15 years ago, I was walking along in a mall, and there were some kids, not kids, young people, that were selling. I think it was perfumes and cosmetics from Israel. And when I asked them where it was coming from, they said, "Oh no, it's from the West Bank, from Israel." And so I said, "No, thank you. I can't buy from that. I'm boycotting." And so they said, "Well, why? Do you believe in the Bible?" So immediately they went into believing in the Bible. And I, just to be argumentative, I said, "No, I don't." Okay? And, but it got me to thinking, what is the relationship? How has this all come about? How have fundamentalist Christians allowed all of this to happen? And what, in spite of the fact that they see that it's a genocide, they see all of these atrocities, and they just kind of gloss over it. I'm just wondering your comments on that, the relationship, because then what I see is happening is that people are going, wait a minute here. Okay, so this has happened now, and this is what they're saying, and this is their positions. How far does it go? How far back does it go? And not only that, just all the Judeo-Christian, even the Muslim religions that seem to be all based on one thing, So how does that work with what's happening now?
Okay, I don't have the historical expertise to comment in a more sophisticated manner on the evolution of Christian views. I'll connect it. I've studied sort of the shift in American public opinion on Zionism, and there was this book put out by the director of the Anti-Defamation League in the late 1970s with his wife, the Perlmutters, and they were arguing just in the American setting for American Jews is, I know for a long time we've most liked kind of the liberal Protestants, right? Because they had this kind of tolerance and general support for some of the same liberal values the heart of the American Jewish community had. But it's time to kind of shift our alliances to the evangelical Christians. And they said, sure, we kind of don't like what they had to say, that Jews are going to be damned, and they're pretty intolerant on a lot of things. But look, these days, Israel is by far the most important thing for the survival of the Jewish people. So swallow your qualms about some of this fanaticism of the right-wing Christians. And yeah, you can still, have drinks with your liberal Christian friends, but make sure that the bottom line really needs to be about Israel. And I think that was symbolically important, that late 1970s book, is that, at least for the American Jewish establishment, they saw kind of the right-wing Christians as now the good guys, and the bad guys then were these liberal Christians that already by the late 1970s were starting to say things about Palestinians. So I know, there's been a broader shift in the United States of Christian evangelicals starting to incorporate advocacy for Israel as a big part, and then gradually Israeli government has kind of jumped to that. And so we now have this scary moment where Netanyahu and his allies, ultimately they see the Christian right in the United States as their number one allies, more so even than AIPAC, ultimately, just because of the numbers and influence of the Christian right. So I'm not able to answer your broader question of how has it shifted over the years, but I have some sense in the American context.
We're going to take two more questions, and then we're going to start wrapping things up. I wanted to just say, too, if you're here for Compass Points, please write your names down and your email addresses for me there before you leave if you're taking off.
Thanks for your presentation. You said in Israel it was 82% are thinking this is okay. What is the basis of calling it a genocide if they have in their Bible that we can destroy Amalek? How much do you think that just the facts don't really matter because we can do a genocide because it says it in our scriptures? Is that happening in Israel, or is it like Ben Gurion said, I don't believe in God, but I believe God gave us the land? Is it that type of dynamic that's happening, or how can you comment on that?
Okay, yeah. I'm not an expert on Jewish theology either, but I'm interested enough in the topic that there too, a big split, say, among what we call the ultra-Orthodox Jews. For a long time, the overwhelming amount were anti-Zionist on the idea that Zionism is a secular thing. God will tell us, when it's time to kind of settle back in the ancient lands. And so for a long time, the ultra-Orthodox Zionists, and there's still sectors that remain anti-Zionist. Anyone seen the show Stitchel on Netflix, I guess? I recommend. So that looks at just one of these ultra-Orthodox communities in Jerusalem. They're not fiercely anti-Zionist like in the old days, but they're still non-Zionist and still refuse to take part in any ceremonies honoring Israel. So that's a big sea change, too, among the Israeli Orthodox Jewish community of moving toward not just a pragmatic Zionism. There was some of that already in the, right after the Holocaust, but this kind of fanatical Messianic Zionism. So I think that's part of why the Israeli Jewish public has just moved further and further right. I also think it is the consequences. This is the topic of my book. It's the consequences even of a mostly secular ideology at one point that played up this sense that Jews are forever in existential problems, in existential danger, and therefore one has to basically do it to them before they do it to you. So I think it's the secular nationalism of Israel already opened the door, but the shift in the views of ultra-Orthodox Jews, where now you have a majority that have very scary extremists and certainly no pretense of any kind of democracy in their elements. That is part of the reason that the numbers are so high. And I think the willingness to engage in sets of violence, including violence against fellow Jews, has certainly gone up.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a bunch of questions. I'm trying to pick one. I think I think I'll ask this, which is whether it's with labor unions or high institutions or Western liberal democracies, or even just in very small like parent-teacher union, why did everyone want to stay away from acknowledging the genocide, or like you say, addressing the elephant in the room? And if there are like morally guided, higher conscience people, how could one even logically explain their perspective for not wanting to say or look at, the elephant in the room?
Well, okay, I'll speak about the labor unions, including the CFA, the California Faculty Association. I think their view was, we're going to get a lot more pushback. And most of us don't really know much about Israel-Palestine, or most of us are not willing to kind of talk about it. And I think, relatively speaking, they didn't think they were getting much pushback from advocates for Palestine. So if they're weighing the political consequences of what's going to happen if I take this action, They will certainly, to try to minimize any resistance and keep what they see as their fundamental objectives. So the CFA is advocating for faculty, is we're going to stay away from this. I'd say at the university level, I mean, I know some of the, like, at least vice presidents, I don't really know the president of San Diego State. In private, some will be very kind of sympathetic to concerns raised by me and others, but they'll say, and this is before the Trump administration came into power, is that we just really want to keep a low profile. We're getting all this pressure from politicians, from donors. We don't see the value until they really get a lot of pushback from the other way. So part of that is just kind of a crude political calculation. What's going to happen if we do this? So the hope, as you said, is that it is starting to change. Right now, I can say it doesn't look like from the university leaders' perspective that they're that influenced by a shift in student opinion. Eventually, maybe they will be. Right now, they're looking at donors and politicians. Their view isn't shifting. Maybe eventually, I mean, that's the hope, right? I mean, people like me, I mean, that's what we want to do. We kind of want to be part of that mobilization of that pressure. But I guess, sorry, the short answer to your question is they're doing their relative political amoral calculation.
Quick follow-up to that is, what I understand is that there's enough pretext even before anybody pushes back to any statement. There's like enough pretext either in the country or in professional organizations or politically that would cause somebody to be afraid of the pushback that might come.
Right.
My follow-up is to your statements earlier during the talk, and I think in general how we all talk, which is we say the US, or we say rich states, or we say the elite, or we say liberal democracies, or we say Trump. How do we disambiguate, like, who are the actual people driving said political sentiment, or the abstaining from calling it a genocide, or genuinely agreeing, like, yeah, we should send Israel military aid? What is the actual tangible thing that helps to understand how these things happen?
Okay, well, that's a really big question. I mean, look, one of the ideas is you follow the money. I guess you also follow, kind of like what Noam Chomsky has written about over the years, besides following the money, is that there is kind of a dominant mindset, and he says we can learn the most kind of from academics, from sort of the respectable intellectuals who they're the ones that make possible this belief system. Let's say in this case, the U.S. interventions are really for democracy and for human rights. And so he looks at the combination of just economic and military interests pushing U.S. foreign policy, but also what he sees essentially as elite ideological actors, whether it's in media or in academia. And so I guess that's the way to go. You're looking for specificity, is to break apart, okay, which kind of economic sectors kind of benefit from the U.S. alliance with Israel or U.S. actions elsewhere. But also, besides just the crude following the money, is how does it work ideologically that it's still, like even now, it's perhaps not as hard now, but it's still hard for a lot of people to hear that there's nothing at all democratic about Israel, and there's nothing at all moral or human rights supporting. Some of you, and myself, you probably know people that actually are not part of the Christian right, but they came out of a Christian community that's still shaped by kind of the Holocaust, the legacy of the Nazi Holocaust, and the sense that there was something necessary and important about Israel. And so that part of looking at the various components, as you're saying. So the ones that are kind of hardline, you're never going to convince, and then others that might be moved. So I guess I don't have a more specific answer for you at this point of the evening, but that would be the way to go, at least to break apart who kind of the economic actors, who are the actors with disproportionate role in shaping kind of public opinion.
Okay, I think now we need to thank Dr. Graubart for a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. Obviously an exhausting day when you teach all day and speak for us at night. So thank you so much for